Hi everyone, I'm Daphne Keller. I'm one of your friendly neighborhood product counsel. And it's my pleasure to once again introduce Jamie Boyle for his second Tech Talk of recent memory. His first one on 7 ways to ruin a technological revolution was well received here and in lots and lots of repeat video views. Jamie gave a great overview of some current problems in IP and especially copyright law. Jamie is, I don't know your title, you're some kind of professor with a fancy endowed chair at Duke Law School. And
that's the very name.
and has all kinds of other great credentials. But the important thing about him is that he's awesome. He's a mentor to a lot of the lawyers here, and he's training a generation of lawyers who, in all modesty, are the lawyers you want to work with. They're the people working on ways to use IP and other areas of law to facilitate tech innovation, to facilitate sharing information and not just constraining it. So Jamie is here today to talk about some new projects spinning out of Creative Commons that focus on science, and I'm not going to step on his lines by telling you what they are, but they're super interesting. And with that, let me introduce Jamie Boyle.
Thanks, Daphne. It's great to be here. There are anthropologists search for universal prescriptions, universal norms that apply across all cultures, against murder, against incest. There's a very strong one which says, don't play cards with a guy called Doc, never eat at a place called Mom's. But the strongest of all, which is found in nearly all cultures, is don't go to Google and give a talk about search technology. And I'm going to violate that norm here, but I am a law professor, so that should be okay. We believe ourselves capable of doing anything. I'm going to talk about the Creative Commons mission in the world of science. The talk is about an organization called Citation Counts. I'm one of the people who helped to found it. It's a part of Creative Commons, an offshoot of Creative Commons. And it's the attempt to take Creative Commons' mission and move it into the world of science. So the Creative Commons mission could be described a couple of ways. One way is that where the legal rules were bad or poorly suited to individuals dealing with the net, then we tried to create hacks, legal hacks, licensing hacks that solved that and let individuals share their content with the world under the terms that they wanted. Whereas copyright automatically applied a kind of default, all rights reserved, you can't do anything with this except perhaps read it. Mode. And so one way of looking at Creative Commons is that it's an attempt to produce sane rules by private agreement when the default rules don't fit the rules the legal system gives you just when you write something or create something or take a picture, don't fit the world of the net very well. So that's one way of looking at what Creative Commons does. A second way is that Creative Commons is an attempt to create an enormous commons of licensed content, so that if you're a documentarian and you don't have much money and you want to be able to get a great soundtrack and to get maybe still pictures of the New York skyline, if you want to get access to poetry or to text, and there are people out there who want to share their material, maybe with attribution, that you can go out and you can assemble all of that and you can make something even though you've never met them. Glenn Brown, who now works at Google, put together the first and still best explanation of Creative Commons, and in which the key phrase was, permission has already been given. And this is a phrase that is actually, which I think Glenn came up with, which has really become central to the way I understand Creative Commons. It's a world in which you don't have to have lawyers and you don't have to have contracts that are other than the Commons, the Creative Commons license, because permission has already been given. So the final way we could look at Creative Commons is that it's an attempt to reduce transaction costs. Transaction costs are economic words for all the hassles that actually are everyday life, right? Doing stuff, talking to lawyers, filling in forms. These are all transaction costs. So how to take all of those ideas, getting rid of or customizing bad default rules that the law sets up, creating a commons of licensed content, cutting down transaction problems, and move them to the world of science. So how did we do it? The first thing we did was to think about the research cycle. So this is the research cycle. Here are materials in the top left-hand box that are actually being described, they're annotated. You've got PubMed links, but this is basically stuff Here's the actual physical stuff to which they refer. It might be plasmids, it might be cell lines. It's more ambitious. It's zebrafish or genetically engineered mice. It's basically the raw materials that biomedical, and I'm going to focus on biomedical science here, although that's not our only charge in Science Commons. It's the raw material that science works with. And as you work with it and you come up, you formulate your hypothesis, you end up publishing, and you publish over there in an article, and there's your article. The article actually says, this is what I'm doing, this is the experiment that I ran, here are my results. That produces some form of innovation, perhaps, in the form of a technology, which might go into a repository, maybe adds to an actual plasmid collection, which then goes back to the circle starts again. The point here is that what you've got is raw material, experimentation, documentation through literature, and then scientists saying, I want to replicate that, I want to extend it, I need to find it, and I want to move on forward. The idea is to say where all of these arrows are, the moment when you're moving from finding the existence of a plasmid to getting it in your hot, sweaty little hands to do experiments on it, or when you've done your experiment to putting it out there, or somebody who's trying to find the experiment or the literature you did, the description in the literature. Each of these stages is a moment where transaction costs can be added, and the Science Commons role is to try and minimize them. I'm going to talk about 2 projects that we've got going that I think are particularly exciting, where I think that some of the minds at Google might be able to help. So how many of you know something or anything about biology? OK, great. That puts you a little bit ahead of me. So this is a double area of ignorance for me. But let me describe for you my rough understanding of the way that we do scientific research, particularly trying to solve disease problems. This is, as you can see, a slide representing some of the processes that go on to make Huntington's disease. Most of these are cell signaling pathways, proteins, genes. The Huntington signifier right here is the thing that causes the disease. Here you have a series of processes leading to cell death. The question is, how do you stop that process from happening? Each line here represents some process, either of cell signaling, or replication, the creation of a protein. And each of these is a potential drug target, a place where you might try and break the link with a drug, right? And the idea is break the link, stop the process. But of course, the difficulty is when you break these links, what if you screw up something else? So using a metaphor that I find explains it very well, think of this as an airline map. Some of these nodes are like the Jacksonville airport. You take it out, air travel in the US is not noticeably affected. Some of them are like Ordway or SFO. You take them out, the whole system shuts down, okay? But the trouble is, until you do it, you're not terribly sure which is which. And the only large-scale model which correctly replicates what will happen is called the human body. And there are obviously problems in working only inside a human body. Here are the number of papers on each of a few of the selected likely targets. 27,000, 4,000, 128,000, 41,000, 10,000. One of the first things that we found when we started investigating the world of science, investigating the empirical literature, talking to scientists, is that the scientists said, for God's sake, don't give us access to more data. We have data coming out our ears. Now, that's scientists in the developed world at rich institutions. Scientists outside of the developed world and not at rich institutions have a very different attitude. But let's just start with the ones in the developed world at somewhere like Berkeley or Stanford or Harvard with full access to all of the expensive databases and journals and libraries. They say, we have a mass of information, and we have very, very primitive tools for figuring out which pieces of that information are valuable. For example, just one of these, one of my colleagues calculated, it would take you 111 years to read all of the available papers on the subject. So the first thing you're going to do is to throw away 99% of all of the potential data out there because you simply can't afford to process it. And you're going to do that according to some rough heuristics that your mentors and professors have kind of programmed into you, right? Like, well, we work only on Huntington's, so let's get rid of all the rheumatology and all the cancer biology, all stuff that actually might be deeply, deeply relevant, right? But I don't have time to look at it, so we're just going to move on. I'll do some text searches. I'll use Google, ironically, which is hardly optimized, even wonderful thing though it is. For searches like this, I'll use the internal search engines, and I'll try and come up with a better model. what would you do it on? Well, this is an abstract of an article in something called PubMed. PubMed articles are freely available to everyone, though the articles they refer to often aren't. But the abstracts contain a lot of information, as you can see. Here's the key set of insights. Study explores the hypothesis that transglutaminase catalyzes cross-linking of Huntington into intranuclear inclusions, and then goes on to say there that here's what the data supports, here's the hypothesis. The question is, how are you going to be able to find that kind of assertion? How are you going to be able to find that kind of assertion and understand how it was linked to the techniques, the methods, I guess I should use the pointer here, the methods by which, there we go, the methods by which the techniques, the insights were generated, and what are the materials on which this was tested, so that if you wanted to replicate it, you would know what materials you needed to replicate or expand the science. And what's the bottom line? The conclusion, based on these and other studies, modulation of transglutaminase activity could be explored as a treatment for Huntington's disease. Second problem. You understand far better than I the world of the internet and the way in which websites and linkages among websites provide a knowledge model which search engines can rank usefully and well, albeit with secret algorithms. This is a discussion of a neuron. These are all of the places where you might actually find out about such a thing. These are all publicly or largely publicly available repositories in which information which might be relevant to the person who's doing Huntington's disease is contained. What we did was we spent a long time talking to people saying, we think that if someone was to go through and take all this publicly available data, all this publicly available text, all the publicly available databases, and run some text recognition software on it, which actually understands, in quotes here, which actually recognizes scientific terms, which actually understands assertions of causation. So X causes Y, inflammation upregulates this protein, for example. Like, understand that that's a subject, verb, object assertion. That you could actually generate a search engine that scientists could use to mine this vast agglomeration of data in a much better way than they currently could. Now, let me tell you, when this stuff actually gets run, we used a proprietary technology called TMIS and ran it on this stuff. It turns out, of course, it produces lots and lots of mistakes. So you have lots of assertions like hunger causes the absence of food, right? Where it gets the basic terms there, but it reverses the causal arrow. But nevertheless, it produces something which is actually pretty good. It can, for example, understand some key points. It can understand that the same gene has 4 or 5 different names in the scientific literature, and see that gene in each place and say, this is the same as this, is the same as this, is the same as this. What it does by doing that is it enables something that's probably the single most important contribution of this. It enables a kind of Rosetta Stone between otherwise incompatible databases. So if you use naming structure 1 for your database, and he uses naming structure 2, the two databases can talk to each other because this software understands that those two genes are actually the same gene and that you're both making assertions about the same gene. So this is a kind of query that a scientist might want to run on this material, which, so far as I know, if they are outside of a large pharmaceutical company, there is no really great available software that actually looks for this in other than a simple text search way, right? That is to say, it goes out and finds the word genes, signal transduction, and pyramidal neurons. What does that mean? Here's a human-readable version of what that query is. Find me potential drug targets for Alzheimer's disease based on what's publicly known. Pyramidal neurons are apparently a key area for the progression of Alzheimer's disease, an area that people think is a possible area, just like the Huntington's chart that I showed you, for interruption with some kind of drug target. So what our first project I'm going to talk to you about, the Neuro Commons, did was took 4 publicly available databases or text repositories. Mesh, which is a kind of universal description of diseases, classifications, neurons, and so forth. It basically gives something a single ID so that you can know you're talking about the same thing. PubMed, which provides the abstract of the journal articles. EntreGene, which is a listing of all of these genes. This is the signal transduction repository. And what it does is say, take all of those and render that same query in what is obviously extremely ugly kind of early stage code to say, produce an answer. And here is actually the answer that it got, which we're told by some scientists passes the BS test. These are actually all genes which are reasonably involved in this. There's the way that the search engine works. There's the Neuro Commons Virtuoso RDF store. This is how we write the queries right now. As you can see, it's kind of like the early days of HTML, where people coded web pages by going into view source of other people's web pages and taking it out and like pasting it in. It's all done in extremely only coder-friendly form, but obviously a human interface is a key thing that we'd be moving on next. And the thing is that there you can actually store your request, and it produces a stable URL. This is that search, and all of the components here can be substituted. So pyramidal neurons, you could say, take exactly the same query, but maybe look for malaria drug targets, right? So that it's the same, the structure is the same. This is an early stage, maybe not even quite alpha stage, software project research engine. So that's the kind of thing that you can produce out of it, saved queries. And then the next thing, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, is once you've done that, how do you move on to developing how do you move on to actually finding the materials that would enable you to do the science? But I want to pause for a moment and explain exactly why I think this is important. There's a war currently going on about access to scientific literature. Any of you who've been involved in science know that there are open access journals, journals which are often under Creative Commons licenses, which are put up on the web for free. Other journals that most explicitly aren't, Science and Nature, for example, much harder to get access to. And there's a big debate about whether or not when governments fund scientific inquiry, they should require the scientific literature, the research that comes out of that, to be put out open access, so that when your tax dollars go to pay for research on rheumatoid arthritis, you don't also have to pay $20 to read the article which comes out of that research, right? So it's a fight, and it's going on, and there will be a solution sometime in the next couple of years, probably some kind of mandate for delayed open access publication. It has to come out within at least 6 months or a year if it's government funded. That's going to be hugely important. But what I think this project, in all of its crudeness, in all of its buggy, sort of basic text file with lots of incorrect assertions shows, is that when we think about open access to scientific literature, we cannot think about it the way most people are thinking about it now, which is that the Mark I eyeball gets to see a picture of text on a page, and that counts as open access. That if I can read Glenn's article in Nature 6 months afterwards, so long as there's a JPEG of each page up there, that should be enough, right? Because I get to read it. What this points to is the fact that it's not just human beings getting access to the literature that we ought to care about. It's computers. Because if that literature is not in machine-readable form, if that database is not accessible to this kind of activity, then we will never have the ability to build something of which this is the very, 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 very crude first prototype. What is that thing? Well, you could think of it as a more precise search engine. I've been told that when you come to Google, you're simply not allowed to say semantic web. So it's a blank blank for science, right? A rough draft of a blank blank for science, applying blank blank technologies to the idea here by forming simple RDF blank blank statements, which couple together to form a blank blank network for science. You could think of it, as I said, a Rosetta Stone. But I think of it as the demonstration project of why our ideas about open access need to be much, much broader. Even if this is total nonsense, that is to say it doesn't work, it's too buggy, it ends up having too many wrong statements in it, like hunger causes the absence of food, another version of it might be better. So, stage one, better search. Why is better search important? We can afford a grotesquely inefficient science research process in the United States because it's a wealthy society. But even in a wealthy society, some candidates for scientific research are marginal economically. Orphan diseases, for example. Huntington's disease doesn't afflict that many people, which means that there isn't a large commercial market. Now, erectile dysfunction, don't you worry. No matter how inefficient the science ecology, there'll be research done on erectile dysfunction. You know, not to worry. Obesity, I think we can all sleep safe in our beds and not worry about obesity research being pursued. Huntington's disease? And then when we get to the diseases of the global poor, even a small level of friction can be enough to kill the project. And in some cases, even with almost zero friction, the project might not be enough. So efficiency in search is a human, morally compelling imperative. We have to have better data retrieval in the sciences or people will die. And they will die disproportionately when they are poor or when their diseases are suffered by relatively few other people. This strikes me as the kind of message that a moral search engine company might take to heart. Just any moral search engine company, I mean, not like focusing on any particular one. It's something where fixing the problem would lead to a better FDB index. The FDB index I get from my colleague Hal Abelson, fewer dead babies, right? Fewer dead babies, right? This is actually a morally compelling thing. So I guess the subtitle of this talk is, what if we put the same ingenuity that we put into allowing teenagers to flirt on MySpace, or for you to find just exactly that tennis racket you're looking for, into finding the cell signaling pathways that are crucial to Huntington's disease, to allowing people to do that at almost zero cost, right? So, compelling idea. But even if you find the data, the articles, you find that one key article in a discipline you would never have thought of looking because you're a cancer biologist, so you didn't think of looking in rheumatoid arthritis journals, although they both deal with inflammation, importantly, and that's actually an important linkage. Even if you find that thing, so what? The next thing you have to be able to do is actually to be able to work with the stuff, the raw materials that scientists have used in order to do their experiments. Now, surprisingly, the single biggest impediment to biomedical research is the unavailability of physical things. You're all thinking, okay, we're an information society, right? It ought to be the information flows. No, it's the physical stuff. There's the results of some of our research into the empirical literature here. 47% of academic geneticists had been rejected in their efforts to secure access to data or materials related to research, and a lot of this was concentrated in the materials. Again, these are plasmids, these are cell lines, these are mice, these are zebrafish. Why does this rejection happen? Well, a pie, think of a pie chart. Reason number one, it takes time to make the materials. You're sitting in your lab, you've got a bunch of cell lines. I say, hey, I want to do an experiment on it. You're going to have to take a grad student and make the grad student go and make a version of the cell line. It just takes time, right? It's a hassle, it's a hassle factor. So that's friction. The second kind of friction, legal friction. Every transfer should be accompanied by a contract, a material transfers agreement. Here you get a great quote from two tech transfer officers who work on these things. One of your colleagues at Big Ag says she'd be happy to send you her transposon insertion lines that saturate the right arm of chromosome 9. You'll just need to have a material transfer agreement signed by your institution. 6 months later, the terms of the agreement are still under negotiation. You've missed your field season, your grant's expired, and there's now a better resource if you just start negotiating material transfer agreement now. Science is really important. The process of getting material across labs is not even like Web 0.5. It's not even like buying a book pre-Amazon.com. It's like ordering from the Sears Roebuck catalog when you lived on the western frontier and things had to come by stagecoach, okay? I mean, science hasn't even made it into the 70s when it comes to the process of facilitated legal transaction between others because permission should already have been given, right? So that none of that was necessary. Now, what's the third reason why this is hard? It's just hard to make the cell line. the process of getting the material transfer is often difficult. The tech transfer officers often customize them. They're supposed to be standard agreements, but there are customizations. Oh, well, what if this is going to lead to a new infertility drug or a drug to cure infertility or stop hair loss or whatever? We want to make sure we get enough money out of that. There's back and forth fights on all of this, and all of that just slows things down. Plus, you just have to sign things. It just takes time. The third reason, maybe one of the most important, secrecy. Scientists are refusing to share at an ever-increasing rate. The rate of denials is going up, which is a really bad trend line for us to have. Why? Well, you've got this cell line. You think you can get 3 papers out of Science or Nature, maybe a fancy new grant, maybe tenure, maybe a fancy chaired professorship of the kind that Daphne was talking about. Why should I give you my cell line? I'm just enabling you to write those articles yourself. Right now, the credit economy favors secrecy, right? The informal credit economy favors secrecy. This is something that Web 2.0 thought could be applied to. So there are the problems. Massive set of problems in MTAs. What's the solution? Well, there's a beginning. There is this Universal Biological Material Transfer Agreement. This is the first page of it. There are 9 pages. It's long. Even the short letter agreement is quite long, but it's a pretty good agreement. It's a good working agreement. It's hard to understand. Even this part, which is just the listing here, is relatively hard to understand. It gets more hard. Even though it's a pretty simple agreement, what it does is pretty simple. So wouldn't it be nice if there were a Creative Commons for materials, in which you could just go in, and as easy as it is for you to license your photo on Flickr, or your video, Creative Commons license it and stick it up on YouTube, on Google Video. Wouldn't it be great if you could automatically put things under the UBMTA or the SLA and have them up there and generate very simple Commons deed, which just tells you what you're supposed to do. You can't use the materials for clinical and commercial purposes. That's what it says, right? This 9-page thing, that's what it says. And you can't distribute without permission. So that the scientists could understand it. This is what we call the human readable layer. Right? And forget the lawyers, right? This is the human readable layer. The scientists could understand it. And imagine a process where social engineering, that is to say pressure, said to entities like the NIH or Duke University, you know, couldn't you get your labs to pre-license all these plasmids under this agreement? Just automatically give permission, right? So it's done already. Sure, you can reserve the patented stuff, the totally proprietary stuff, but the rest, right? Couldn't you just make it a commons? And here's the really cool part. Once you've done that, every time that I go to Glenn's lab and say, I need one of your plasmids, then that's going to create an electronic record. And the electronic record is going to say, Glenn Brown's lab produced 3,000 plasmids last year. 3,000 plasmids were demanded by other people. 500 zebrafish, 20 genetically engineered mice, knockout mice, skid mice. That's more than anyone else at Berkeley, Stanford, wherever, by a factor of 5. That Glenn Brown must be a real hotshot scientist. Suddenly we have a number. We all love numbers, rankings, right? We all look at the awful US News and World Report survey of colleges. Look at citation counts. Lawyers now, academics nowadays, basically check their citation counts like every morning, like the weather, you know? It's raining, my citation count's up 2%. Right? Citation counts are hugely important. They're the way that the informal economy runs. This is an idea to flip the informal credit economy so that the benefit is to sharing, not to secrecy. And this is a second idea that I think Creative Commons really got. If you can make sharing easy enough and get benefits out of it and have those benefits flow back to people, then more people will share. The economists who look at this stuff tend to look at it as static. They say, okay, people aren't sharing, and they aren't sharing for a good reason, and the good reason is they want to get benefit out of the stuff they're holding on to. They never think of like, okay, could we flip that system technically and legally so that they could get just as much or maybe even more benefit by doing the more socially desirable thing? So again, that's an idea which is generalizable beyond this. So that would be the metadata that would travel with the material. So standardized licenses, permission giving in advance, allow repositories to fill requests. So now imagine the final link. Remember we started off with the journal article? What if in the journal article, when Glenn Brown writes up his research, in the footnote it says, and I used this plasmid, hyperlink. And the hyperlink goes directly to a description of the plasmid with its license attached in a repository that can provide that plasmid. Now, that could be a for-profit repository, the eBay or FedEx or Amazon.com of cell lines. You know, it's certainly a business I'd love to get into, you know, just, you know, all that goop in FedEx containers flying across the country, you know, it's just, there is a lot of it, by the way. That's the way scientists, everything is done by FedEx. But imagine that process where the article is itself the link to the material needed for the next iteration. Now, the thing is, as I'm describing this, those of you who don't know the world of biology will go, well, what he's describing is like not even Web 2.0 stuff, right? This is like pretty trivial stuff. But we don't have it in science. I really want to stress this. Science isn't even Web 0.5. And these are just two ideas. Better search and closing the cycle of journal, repository, credit, so that you could say, wow, I like the sound of Brown's work. Click here. Hey, it's available for $24.95 from AdGene, their processing costs. Maybe it's for profit, maybe it's not for profit. I don't care. I would love for people to get into lowering the price, commoditizing cell lines. It's got to be an accredited repository, of course. Got to make sure that it's actually correctly produced, because the scientist's going to have a vested interest in making sure that cell line's not contaminated. So, you know, some safety concerns there, but nothing that we couldn't possibly deal with. So, and then the cycle starts again. So basically, thinking about lowering transaction costs at each stage of this cycle, using some of the insights that are jejune, uninteresting, mundane in the existing world of CC licensed content, search engines, Web 2.0, whatever, just taking some of that ingenuity and applying it. Whose job is that in science right now? Kind of NIH, kind of the national academies, but right? No one is sitting here going, how could we transform this? And the thing is, in many cases, they're not doing it because they don't see the opportunity for making a profit. The private pharma is doing stuff like this, but it's all internal. And good for them. I mean, I'm not putting that down. This is great. They're doing this versions, but it's inside Merck. Merck has its own versions of this kind of stuff inside Merck, right? But those are all walled gardens. And the point about walled gardens is they don't give you the benefit of the large commons. It's like, again, early day search engines, intra-company. So these are the people who've helped us with funding, the IQ Foundation, Terranode, MacArthur. This whole thing that I've described to you has been done on $600,000. Which is trivial money by science standards. I mean, it's actually really embarrassing amounts of money. We have to not tell scientists because they basically don't start paying attention until you get up above the $50 million level. It's too small. So that's the idea behind Science Commons. It's an idea that I actually think there's a culture. The biggest problem here is a cultural gap. That we actually have a lot of the tools that we need. Conceptual tools, licensing tools, metadata tools, search engine tools, sitting over in the world of searches for Britney Spears, right? And all we need to do is drag and drop that stuff into the science room. All we need to do? No. Because it turns out that there's huge differences. We had to learn to stop dealing with copyright licenses and start thinking about licenses over stuff. When I talked to Daphne about it, she goes, well, what kind of intellectual property right are you talking about over these cell lines? I said, no, Daphne, this is old-fashioned property, like things. She goes, oh yeah, I've heard of that, she said. You know, remember the old day when we had like stuff? Yeah, physical property rights. Wow, that's so cute. So there's lots of customization. There are lots of problems that I haven't mentioned, ranging from patient privacy to bioterrorism fears, to, right? There's all kinds of stuff that needs to be dealt with. There are enormous problems. There's also commercial entities, some of whose interests run along these lines and some of whose interests don't entirely run along these lines. But definitely a lot who do. So all I'm saying is that pursuing this kind of thing would be a good idea. Here's a second version of this that I just think is a nice little end lagniappe at the end. This is the Allen Brain Atlas, an amazing atlas of mouse brains, developed by Paul Allen's, funding from Paul Allen, one of the early Microsoft developers. And it basically cost $100 million to develop. And it has all these really, really cool ways of imaging and slicing mouse brains. So you can basically do all kinds of virtual stuff on mouse brains, even if you're sitting at a terminal in Kinshasa or Kyoto or wherever. So this was we got some of the publicly available material from the Allen site and simply made it a mashup in the layer of Google Maps. So now you can layer it. Right? And again, this was something I don't think anybody had thought about doing it, and this has already been picked up by one of the big bioinformatics networks, which has $100 million worth in funding. This was done with basically chewing gum and baling wire in 25 hours for a volunteer's time. The point is that stuff that on the level of traffic maps or crime data, all of you have thought about a million times and said, that's trivial, I'll never get anywhere by doing that, in the science world has not yet been tried. I really want to say, big frontier here, really big frontier. So to be done, what's needed? Money, smart people. It is embarrassing to come to Google and talk about search technology, particularly one that talks about the semantic web. I'm sure that there are all kinds of things wrong with the Neuro Commons model we've got here. I'm sure that it's buggy. It may be that the process that we imagine, which is that going forward we have an almost like Wikipedia-like process of correction, where somebody who's working on Alzheimer's says to his graduate students, okay, your job is to go in and make sure that this incredibly buggy Neuro Commons thing is right about our area of science so we can use it in the lab. And that's your responsibility. Go in and check it. And since each assertion leads back to an article, right, it's a simple footnote that just refers to an article, it's easy for you to read the article and goes, wait, hunger doesn't cause the absence of food. It's the absence of food that causes hunger, you idiot, and flip the causal sign and so make the Neuro Commons better. That's the way we imagine it getting better. A bigger and bigger community with more and more people thinking about what they can do. That's the great thing about the Commons, right? Is that there's always someone who has something smarter to do with your content than you thought of, right? That's the secret of the Commons. Smart people, money, more experimentation, and I think a conceptual shift. A shift that starts to look at the world of science and say, what if we took everything that we have learned about networks, about the way that networks function, I think the World Wide Web of networks, about the way that search works on networks, about the way that distributed creativity could work across networks. And let's figure out which of those can be translated into the world of science. Not all of them can, of course, but some of them could, and it would be really exciting. So I hope that you find that of interest. ScienceCommons.org is where you can find a lot of this information, and that's my contact. Thank you very much. Questions? Sorry, is the software open source? Yes. So, so I've been asked to repeat the questions, just so the remote audience can hear them. So the question is the software open source? Right now, all of the data and the tools that we are developing is open source, BSD licensed. The tools we use to do the initial text recognition, that is proprietary, although its output is of course available freely. Next stage would be developing open source, excellent scientific text recognition software for lots and lots of areas of science, because the proprietary software is expensive. Interestingly, we've had very very generous support from two proprietary companies, Terranode and Millennium Pharmaceuticals, who've allowed us to use their systems, and in some case even to release their systems under, to release versions of their systems under open licenses. And they believe, I think, I don't want to put words in their mouth, let me rephrase this. It may be that they believe that there is a kind of open source model here where there's room for a lot of companies to exist on top of a giant commons of science information, the same way that, say, IBM or Red Hat exist in the free software world, right? And this is something we don't currently have in the sciences, though obviously you know it very well. But in answer to your question, I think one next stage would be, let's not just deliver the stack, the Neuro Commons kernel as open source, or even our search interface as open source. Let's have the stuff that generated it in the first place and make that open source too. There are open source versions of that search technology, but right now it's not as good, the stuff that does the text recognition in the first place.
Are there any efforts underway to get scientific researchers to
deliver their work product in the form of structured data in the first place?
Yeah, great question. So are there any efforts to get scientists to deliver their data pre-structured, pre-metadata encoded? There have been some attempts, and they've all failed massively. One reason why we went this route, which is trying to figure it out post hoc with software, is because it was impossible to make it happen beforehand. Now, I can imagine one way in which that would happen, which is if the NIH said 0.5% of every grant is for metadata encoding of the results. And you have, it's a deliverable, right? You don't get your final payment until we see your whatever it would be, RDF triples, whatever it is, that says, here are my hypothesis materials and whatever. That would definitely work. Like Creative Commons, this is the second best private fix post hoc rather than the public structuring ex ante.
So actually, my question was about the idea of using a graduate student powered wiki to help improve the semantics, and that would be that's sort of like a secondary, right?
Right.
Okay. And so my actual question is if that happens, is there an issue with validating the results and making sure that do they need peer review? Does there need to be a gatekeeper for that, the same way there is for the articles?
Excellent. So the question is, suppose, how are we going to improve the results? One idea I had mentioned was the idea of having curation by graduate students after the fact to make sure that the assertions were correct. And one obvious concern, which often raised about things like Wikipedia, is can we trust this material? And obviously in the sciences, you would say, well, this is maybe even more important than knowing whether someone sung a particular song or not, right? So does it need peer review? I think the answer of how we might end up having various forms of peer review is still TBD, right? To be decided. That will be developed. But here's the reason why I don't think it's too much of a problem. Each one of these assertions is in the form of X causes Y, or so says this article, right, at this page, or this abstract, right? So that's what it is. So when that is being used by someone, all they are getting is what is effectively a hyperlink to an article. The actual information they need is in the article. And it's not being given to, Joe layperson who's going to go on and do like brain surgery on himself. Its users are scientists who are expert in their particular area. So I think, therefore, that while we would obviously never want to accept any kind of errors, if there are errors, they are easily discarded by the person looking at them and easily, perhaps even you would hope, corrected at the moment when they're discovered. I got this in the search page and it's wrong. Just as when you scan a search engine page in an area you're familiar with, you rule out those, that's nonsense, right? That's just garbage, that's an accident of the search, and focus on the others. So I think that makes it acceptable to have a less expensive level of peer review. Having said that, it might be that there are subspecialties or particular areas where people might want to say, we want our core of material in our scientific field to be like beyond reproach with a 0 error rate. And that would simply require them then to come in and insert their excellent validation structure on top of it. And of course, the benefit of an open system is they could, and it would be distributed, and that would be entirely up to them. But that's me just guessing of how it might evolve. We've certainly got some autism, Alzheimer's, and Huntington researchers who seem interested in doing something like that.
You mentioned that you were only talking about the biomedical aspects of Citation Counts. What other parts of Citation Counts?
Excellent question. So what beyond Biomed? Biomed we picked because the problems are huge. The human impact is obviously enormous. And there had been some existing efforts, particularly in the form of open journals, where we thought we could maybe leverage some stuff. But we have preliminary contacts with people in the geospatial data area. I think it'd be very important for things like environmental science. We've worked in the past with people like the people who are doing the national map, where there's sort of all these different layers of data about the country in there. There's been a lot of interest from anthropologists and archaeologists who would love the idea that everything that you have about a site would be able to play together with all of the other information about that site, so that researchers from other disciplines could come in and actually find the thing that they needed, because the two types of data which are currently incompatible would actually be meshed together. The model of the Neuro Commons strikes me as scalable across many disciplines. Obviously, different text search mechanisms. You'd need an archaeology-specific one, an anthropology-specific one. But we have a lot of interest for people in those areas. In physics, in high-energy physics, there's already much more of a going concern that's working on these. The high-energy physics and astronomical people are way ahead on this. Archive.org has really done excellent stuff on this. In the Human Genome Project has obviously released a vast amount of material. Sanger and Wellcome Trusts and the whole push behind the Human Genome Project and the Bermuda Accord was to get this kind of data out there. So research on evolutionary biology and so forth is perhaps more advanced in certain areas. But basically, I think it's just a matter of enthusiasm and money to scale this out to other areas.
Scientists and academics in particular seem to be more reticent to do anything new, especially something dramatic. How do you get momentum for this and convince people that it's a really good idea, they should spend their grad students' time on this instead of their paper?
Right. So the question is, how do you get scientists to buy into this? Because they can be more reticent and get it going, which, by the way, I entirely agree. Justifiably, scientists don't want to waste their time doing something if it turns out that it's not going to yield. But the first thing is you have to give them something that's already useful. Right? So don't come to them with an idea. Come to them with a search engine that already yields some results, and ideally, some of which are wrong. Right? Because then they go, well, this is right, but that's stupid. Right? The harnessing of the "that's stupid" impulse is a very powerful idea. That needs to be fixed, right? I mean, this is the way open source software works, right? It's like the person who reports the bug, is much more likely to fix it. So I think that's one thing. I think a second thing is, for a lot of these people, the abstractions of the open source Web 2.0 search community are completely outside of their frame of reference, and they also, understandably, are in a world which has a prestige economy that's in a particular way. So they might be, very, keen to share, but they go, I kind of worried, I spent all this time developing this plasmid, and I sent it over to that woman in the other lab, and now she scooped me. I think it's hard for you to convince someone to say, no, you'll be better off if you share, so long as lots of other people do. There's a scale problem. So the answer there is to move at every level. So, for example, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is after the Nobel, probably the single most prestigious prize in sort of biomedical research, science, and so forth, fully funds, and I mean fully, every single thing in the labs of the people that it supports, who are brilliant, genius scientists. Those people already operate in a kind of sort of semi-commons, a closed commons, where they're sort of, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute says, we encourage you to share among all of the other people in this network, right? So you find networks like that already exist, that have already begun the process, and you find people like funders who have some ability to say, this will lead to bigger grants for you, or renewal of your grants, and you encourage them to do it. And finally, you work with the journals. So for example, we've been talking to the Public Library of Science about PLOS One, which is for putting up journal articles in sort of early stage or without going through a complete. It is peer reviewed, but it's not completely peer reviewed in the way that their flagship journals are. And they're thinking about implementing this. So if you talk about a material in here, we want you to use this system. So I think if you approach it at every level and give people incentives to do it, then that will build the level of content. And it's very similar to what we did with Creative Commons licenses at the beginning. How do you persuade people to do it? When there aren't there's no other material, you try and get it embedded in Flickr, right? You try and get it in, companies like Magnitude. You try and, you make it pervasive so that you see it everywhere, and then you get people to uptake, and then at that point the cycle starts. It's a great question. Just a little louder. A lot of interest internationally, and we're only limited by the fact that we don't have, we already have people who we want to be working with internationally, basically a limitation of funds. Two kinds of partnerships here, I think. One is that a lot of foundations who have been very resistant to fund science infrastructure in the developing world because they're focused on the have been resistant to funding science infrastructure in the developed world because what they want to do is build research capacity in the developing world. I think we're beginning to convince them that if you fix the problem globally, then you fix the problem globally, which is like includes everywhere. And so that's a bridge which has enabled us to get people in other countries to work with it. The other thing is that there are existing efforts through things like the European Union and the OECD, where we've had a lot of interest in these kinds of initiatives. And again, it's just a matter of, once you've got a working prototype, you're a lot further along. And basically these two things that I described to you, the Neuro Commons and the MTA, are ready for launch in the next 2 months. So we hope we're launch at a very alpha, crude, buggy level, but launch nevertheless. And so we'll be launching with, 5,000 plasmids already pre-licensed, for example. And lots of scientists and labs committing too. So once we get that, then I think the international interest will accelerate. One more question and then we're done. Thank you very much.